Morning, folks. How you doing? Might as well do me just fine, thanks. Good to be with you. And I know, you're sort of paid to say that, and, I'm supposed to say good to be with you and all that kind of stuff, but it is. It's my first time that I've been to this church, so it is good to be with you. Good to see a couple of faces I recognise, most of you I don't, but I do know your son, and now I know why he... Anyway. I'm Murray. I work at the union office, and that's probably enough about me. But anyway, I'm a teacher as well. Well, that was my background. I ran schools for about 15 years before I went into youth ministry, and then secretary of education there in South Queensland for a while. Been in the union for a few years, but anyway. When I was a teacher, I used to teach storytelling. I don't know if you teach that. I'm not sure what you teach, but and one of the things I always told my students was never start a story with "once upon a time." Oh my goodness. Anyway, so that's me. Anyway, once upon a time, there was a king. And this particular king was a mad king. In fact, he was so mad that he had 3 of his sons put to death in the last 2 weeks of his life. He could not stand the thought of giving his kingdom or his empire to anyone else, even his own family. He was dying of a rotten disease. In fact, he stank. And you could smell him from one end of the palace to the other. And that wasn't too good for his touchy temper that he had, because he had a fierce temper and a foul temper. And even though he knew he was dying, he said that he didn't want to give his kingdom up to anyone. And as I said, he killed 3 of his sons. He was hated by his subjects. He was hated by his people. He was particularly hated by the Jews. And one of the reasons why the Jews hated him so much is because they had this church, was known as the Temple, and the mad king had his emblem, which was a golden eagle, struck down in Egypt by the metallurgists down there, and he had it brought all the way back home to where his palace was. And there at the temple, he placed his golden eagle above the lintel of the eastern gate of the temple. But before he did, he had the lintel, which is the top part of the gate, lowered, so that when you went into the temple, you had to bow down to go into the temple. If there's one thing the Jews hated, it was to bow down to any graven image. They hated him for it. The Jews hated him so much that there in the university in the city, there was 40 students and 2 teachers. And they decided that upon the death of the king, this mad king, when they heard that the king was dead, they would chop down that golden eagle. And they walked around during the day with small hatchets under their cloaks. And they had a password. And the password was, "The lion is dead." And when that password was uttered, before you can say snap and duck bills, they would be up on that gate, chop, 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 and the eagle would fall. Now, I don't know how the rumour started. You know how rumours start. Perhaps it was one of the soldiers guarding the bedchamber whispered to the guard in the hall and said, King's not too well today. And perhaps the soldier in the hallway brushed past the cook in the galley and said, King's almost gone. And perhaps the cook went to the marketplace to buy some of the fruit and veggies that particular day, and he said to one of the merchants, take it from me, King's almost dead. And then someone spoke to someone, and someone spoke to someone, and sooner or later, word got around that the king had died. And the 2 teachers and the 40 students heard that the king had passed away, and the words, the lion is dead, was uttered. And true to form, as soon as the password was uttered, they were up on the ladder, chop, chop, chop. There was a resounding crash, an applause, and also a resounding cheer as the eagle fell to the ground. And guess who sat up in bed and looked out the window? And he wasn't amused. So much so that he got those 20 students and the 2 teachers, and he bound them together with ropes, and he burnt them all. And after he burnt them all, he took their ashes and he went to Solomon's colonnade right up on top of the temple, and he spread the ashes to the wind. Because the Jews believed that if their bodies aren't buried in toto, that they'd never see the hereafter. When the king laid back down on his bed, satisfied that the students and the 2 teachers had been silenced and punished, he also uttered a decree that 1,500 of the most prominent Jews in the city would be rounded up, and they would be collected and put in the middle of the hippodrome. Now, the hippodrome isn't a place where hippopotami take off and land. It's a place where you play games. So he ordered that 1,500 Jews, prominent Jews, be collected and placed in the middle of the hippodrome. And also he decreed that and asked and demanded that his regiment archer guard would stand on the periphery of the hippodrome with their arrows notched. And when that guard heard the words that the lion was dead, they were to begin firing until every one of those prominent Jews were dead in the middle of the hippodrome. And with those words on his lips, he closed his eyes and he fell into a coma. And it was pretty apparent fairly soon that he was not going to come out of that coma and that he would eventually die. His sister actually took over, and he sent a message to the 1,500 Jews in the hippodrome. And the message was, my suggestion to you is that you go on a long holiday. Which they did. Sent the archers home, and the king died. Now, the next day, the will of the mad king was read to the 3 remaining sons. And being a mad king, you can imagine that it was a mad will. Strange. And the will read as such: to my first remaining son, you're such a half-wit that I leave to you half of my kingdom. And that remaining son, that's how the remaining son became the ethnarch, or the half-king of Judea. To my second remaining son, you're just a quarter wit. And because of that, I will leave you a quarter of my kingdom. And that's how quarter wit became the tetrarch of the mad king's kingdom. And he took rule of what we would know now as the area of Galilee. And to the third remaining son, who happened to be the best of the three, he said, you're such a twit that I'm only going to leave you 10 cities. And one of those cities is named after that son, the city of Caesarea Philippi. Well, the three sons looked at each other. Half-wit stood up, went and sat down on his dad's throne, which was a golden throne with lions on the armrests. And he took his father's crown and he stuck it on his head and he said, so there. Pretty soon the Jews realised that there was a new king sitting on the throne, so they sent in a delegation, and the king was promising this and that, and he was very magnanimous and he was very generous, and, and they asked for this and they asked for that, and he said, sure, and pretty soon they realised that he wasn't going to deliver on any of his promises. So they staged a little demonstration in the temple courtyard, and Half-wit sent down a couple of his guards. They didn't like that, so the Jews threw rocks at the guards. The guards came back. Half-wit said, right, I'll fix you lot. So he sent in 6 of his regiment soldier guards on horseback. Now, the Jews didn't appreciate having unclean animals in the temple precincts. So the Jews stoned the guards and the horses to death. Half-wit lost his temper, sent in his National Guard, and history tells us that the blood of 3,000 Jews flowed out of the temple gate that day. I'm a younger brother of 2 boys, and I know how it works. Quarter-wit says to half-wit, shouldn't have done that. I'm going to tell on you. And half-wit takes a boat and he begins to sail across the Mediterranean to Rome, to Caesar Augustus, to tell on his brother. And half-wit decides, well, if you're going, I'm going too, because you and I both know the one that gets home first is the one that's usually believed. So half-wit takes a boat and he's sailing across the Mediterranean, and 50 of the prominent Jews says, well, you know what, we're not happy with what's happened here in the temple precincts. 3,000 of our mates are now dead, so they get in a boat and they go across the Mediterranean as well. And these 3 boats are racing each other across the Mediterranean towards Rome. Who got there first? Half-wit did. He had the better boat. He got there one tide before the other 2 boats. Up the Appian Way, into Rome, sat down in the presence of Caesar, delivered his story, and he was believed. And Caesar Augustus said that you can continue to be the king of this particular region, and he went back home. Before he left, He said to 10 of his officials, "Look after this place until I return." And when he returned, he met with these 10 officials to get a full report. If you'd like to turn to Luke and the 19th chapter, you'll find there that Jesus knew the story very, very well. And he tells this story, and it starts at verse 12. Luke 19, verse 12. "Therefore," he said, "a certain nobleman went to a far country to receive for himself kingdom and to return." 13. "So he called 10 of his servants, delivered to them 10 minas, and said to them, 'Do business till I come.' But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, 'We will not have this man to reign over us.' Verse 15. "And so it was that when he returned, having received the kingdom, then he commanded these servants to whom he had given money to be called to him, that he might know how much every man had gained by trading." And then the chapter continues. If you've got a red letter Bible, you'll see that it's Jesus actually speaking. And if you come down to verse 26, he says, "For I say to you that anyone who has will be given, and from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him." 27, "But bring here those enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, and slay them before me." Jesus actually spoke this parable. Everyone knew the story of the mad king and his 3 sons. And Jesus was in the house of Zacchaeus when he told this parable, and you could look out the window of Zacchaeus' house, and there you would see over the valley the great dome of the great temple on the mountain. And there behind that dome you would see the palace of the mad king, Herod the Great. As I said, Jesus knew the story very, very well of the mad king, because it all happened around about the time of his birth. Herod was the demented bad king and mad king who had ordered the execution of all the boys in Bethlehem. The Jews were terrified of him. Joseph and Mary shot through to Egypt for a time to escape. You probably know that. You'll pick that up in Hosea chapter 11, but you'll also pick it up in Matthew chapter 2. And there he stayed for a while, and when it was okay to return home to around about Bethlehem in Judea, the word was out that the mad king's son, who was also a tyrant, he had all the pettiness of his father but not his cunning, was ruling in Judea. And because of that, Joseph and Mary headed north, and they settled in a little town called Nazareth, fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 11 that he would come from Nazareth, a Messiah would come from Nazareth. Scholars and historians say that we can fairly accurately pinpoint the birth of Christ. Interestingly enough, we know that the 40 students and their 2 teachers were executed on a lunar eclipse. And that lunar eclipse was 4 BC, March 13. Half-wit grew worse. In fact, became so tyrannical that the Jews sent another delegation to Rome to complain about Herod. His name was Herod Archelaus. And Caesar Augustus, a little bit tired of the bad news from Judea, decided that he would request an audience. So he wrote a letter that would be delivered to Archelaus, and he sealed it with his wax seal, and he sent the order back to Jerusalem, where Archelaus, with trembling hand, opened the letter, and it was a summons for him to appear in front of Caesar Augustus. In the morning, he was gone. Up the Appian Way, into Rome, into the audience with Caesar Augustus. And Caesar Augustus said, you know what? I just can't trust this family anymore. And he redeployed Herod Archelaus to a small outpost way on the farthest northern reaches of the kingdom of where you and I know where Vienna now stands. And there Archelaus spent the rest of his days in a small little province there in the northern reaches of the Roman kingdom. And Caesar said, I'm not going to trust this family anymore. I'm not going to put one of the family back into Judea as the ruler of that particular area. And what he did was he put instead what was called a proconsul. And the proconsul's name, does anyone know who he was? Pontius Pilate. That's how Pontius Pilate became the procurator, or an officer who presides over a province. That's how Pontius Pilate came into being the procurator of Judea. Anyone know any great families? That was a great story today. What an interesting story, eh? You know, there's been some great families through history. I think of some of you might remember, those of us that are advancing in age, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the last of the great 5-star generals of the Second World War, who later became, of course, the President of the United States. And when he became the President of the United States, there was a journalist that travelled from Washington down to where Dwight D. Eisenhower and the family, 9 boys, were born and raised in Kansas. And the journalist came up to Dwight D. Eisenhower's mother, Ida. And Ida was on the front porch sitting in a rocking chair. And the journalist introduced himself and asked the question of Ida, well, what do you think of your boy now? And she turned to the journalist and said, which one? For you see, Roy was one of the top lawyers in the United States. Milton had become the president of a couple of universities, and Edgar was a top banker in the United States and had become the vice president of the Commerce Trust in the United States, and the other brother was the president of the United States. And if you trace the history of the brothers, they all became very, very successful. She turns around and says, which one? While all this is playing out, there's another great family that is just beginning to grow and mature. The father's name is Zechariah. Mother's name is Elizabeth. And they have a son. And the son's name is John. Became known as John the Baptist. And John the Baptist, or John, would have sat on his mum's knee, Elizabeth, and she would tell him stories, and she would tell him how when she was carrying him that he leapt in the womb when the cousin came and announced that she was pregnant, and she would tell him that, you know, one day, son, you're going to have a special message. You have been born for a special mission. And little John would go out to the backyard and he'd preach to the rocks in the backyard until such time it came time for him to leave home and head out in the wilderness. And you know the story probably fairly well. And there out in the wilderness he spent some time until he came to the crossroads, and there at the crossroads, he began to preach the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah. And pretty soon, some of the travellers walked past and they heard. And they reached town and they told someone who told someone, and pretty soon the crowds were coming out from the city to hear this guy preach. And man, he had a message. And man, could he preach. He's preaching the Messiah. He's preaching the coming of the King. And pretty soon, guess who heard? One of Herod's family. His name? Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas summoned John to his court to deliver the message in person. And as John came through the door, and the two were seated up the front, there was Antipas's wife, Herodias, and there was Herod Antipas, and John looks at the two. What would you say? What would you say? If you had an audience with, what's his name? Albanese, Overeasy, whatever his name is, what would you say? Hey, nice work on the tax. Hey, you've been doing well with standard of living. Thanks for that. What would you say? Well, I'll tell you what John said, because the scriptures tell us. He lines the two of them up and says, I know all about you, you two, you filthy pair. She's not your wife. You've stolen her. You've stolen her from your brother. She's not even your wife. And I tell you what, Herodias didn't like that. She started to boil. As he stripped down Herod Antipas and the wife Herodias, pretty soon John was taken downstairs and he was on the inside looking out. Can you imagine what it must have been like for him? A man of the great outdoors, now cooped up in a tiny little cell, a dingy little cell with a tiny little window where if you stood on your tiptoes you could see outside. And he sat there day after day after day, but he was quite calm about it because he knew that his cousin would sooner or later come in here and he would go hee-ha and the soldiers would be thrown left and right and he would bust him out of jail. And he sat there and figured that soon I'll leave this place because my cousin will come and get me. And his disciples came to visit him. And he sent his disciples to Jesus with the question, what's going on? Tell me what's going on. I'm in here and I don't know what's going on out there. Tell me what's going on. So the disciples went and saw Jesus. They tapped him on the shoulder and he spins on his heel. And they ask him, can you deliver something to John? And Jesus says, tell him what you see. The blind regain sight, the dead are raised, lepers are healed. And with that, he spins back round on his heel and he begins to address the crowd. Disciples go back, they see John, says, wow, man, I'll tell you what, he's really doing some amazing stuff out there. You know, blind people are seeing and he's raising the dead and the deaf can hear and lepers are being healed. And John says, does he say anything about me? He doesn't even mention your name. Desire of Ages, Mrs. White tells us that while John was in prison, he slowly emptied himself out of his self-importance. She goes on to say that as he sat there in prison, he never really understood what was going on in the mind of his cousin, but he accepted it and he became comfortable with it. upstairs, there was a party going on. You see, Antipas's first wife, when she was ditched, she wasn't too happy about that. And we find that when she went back home, she was the daughter of King Aretas of he was a Nabatean. Nabateans are those that lived what you and I would now know in Syria and Jordan and down into Saudi Arabia. And they looked after and controlled the routes north and south, the trade routes north and south. And he wasn't too happy that his daughter had been ditched for this other woman, Herodias. So he started to make noise that he would perhaps take some revenge on Herod Antipas around the area of Galilee where Antipas ruled. And Antipas heard about it. So what he did was he threw a party. And this party, he invited all the surrounding desert chieftains to come to the party to try and get them on side just in case Aretas actually attacked. And Antipas was hoping that these desert chieftains would back him up and would join in the fray, and he'd be able to defeat a dad that wasn't too happy. So the party began, and they were feasting upstairs, and John would have been able to hear the feasting that was going upstairs from his dungeon downstairs. And pretty soon the wine started to flow and minds became a little bit addled with wine, and in due course the tables were cleared away and it was time for the entertainment. And Antipas and Herodias had one thing up their sleeve, a card that was an ace card, and it was Herodias' daughter Salome. And history tells us that she was the most beautiful young kid. And Antipas asked her to come in and dance for the crowd. He asked that she would dance the dance of the 7 veils. Now you think that that might be a figment of Cecil B. DeMille's imagination? No, it's real. You read the history books, it's an actual dance, the dance of the 7 veils. And there in the flickering candlelight, Salome danced before the king and those who were at the festivities. And there, as she danced, one by one the veils dropped to the ground. And for a split moment at the end, there she danced naked before the king. Quickly covered herself and left the room. And the king, feeling magnanimous and also wanting to be a hotshot in front of his mates, called her back in. And he said, "That was magnificent. Ask me for anything, even up to half the kingdom." Now, that's not literal, it just means I'll give you a lot. Ask me whatever you want, even up to half the kingdom. And Salome goes behind the curtain and asks her mum, "What will I ask for?" And Herodias says, "Ask for the head of John the Baptist on a silver platter." John would have heard the footsteps of the execution. He would have seen the glint of the sword in the candlelight. And by morning, his head was stuck on a stake, facing the little town in Judea where he came from, a little hick town called Judah. Mrs. White goes on to say, why did Jesus allow John the Baptist to drink the lonely martyr's cup? she indicates that John the Baptist would be a comfort and an inspiration and encouragement to the millions of martyrs that would follow. He gave up his life, not fully understanding why, but he accepted it. And as martyrs throughout history went to the rack, faced the guillotine, the hangman's noose, they would be comforted by the testimony and the life of John the Baptist. Two men represent essentially two groups in the world today. All of mankind can be represented by these two men, Herod Antipas and John. Antipas, anti, against. Pater, the Father. Antipas means against the Father. John means beloved of the Father. We're either against the Father or beloved of the Father. When Jesus finally returns, there'll be a great reunion. I'm going to love to see Jesus and John the Baptist meet for the first time. What a reunion that'll be. Revelation 22 verse 12 says, you'll be honoured for your work. I'm not standing before you this morning saying that we're saved through works, but it's pretty hard to be saved without them. And at that meeting, three great truths will become clear. And the three great truths are those truths that the world has largely dismissed and minimised and diminished and divorced. And the three truths are this. God made me. I'm not descendant from some slug in a slime. God made me. God died for me. And God's coming back for me. And they're the three great truths. Karl Barth, known as probably the greatest theologian of the 20th century. In fact, his theology is so deep that his theology has been likened to Einstein's maths and physics. He was a Swiss theologian. Last name is spelled B-A-T-H, but it's actually pronounced Barth because he's Swiss. And Karl Barth wrote many, many books about theology and the life of Christ and Scripture, and he became the giant of theology in the 20th century. And upon his retirement, Karl Barth agreed that he would front up to Princeton University in the Great Hall and he would preach his last sermon, public sermon. And there at the end of the sermon, he would open up the floor to questions from the floor. And of course, all the scholars and all the teachers of the law there in Princeton started licking their lips. The place holds about 3,000 people, and for weeks they were crafting the questions that they would like to ask Karl Barth in person. And the day came and Karl Barth took the stage and he presented his address, and then he opened it up to questions. And he was answering this and that, and all the fancy hotshots in their gowns and their fancy little hats were asking their questions that they had taken weeks and weeks to perfect. And Karl Barth was answering the questions, and everyone was amazed. And it started to come to the end of the time together, and Karl Barth noticed a young man right up the back of the auditorium who'd had his hand up for a long, long while. And Karl Barth swept the audience, and through all the sea of hands, he picked that young man. And he said, "Young man, you've had your hand up for a long, long while now. What, in fact, is your question?" And the young man stood up and he fumbled with the hem of his shirt and he looked down because he was addressing the greatest theologian of the 20th century with his question. He cleared his throat and he asked this question: "Dr. Barth, what is the most profound thing that has ever passed through your mind?" And instantly, everyone in that auditorium knew that this young lad had asked the perfect question. Karl Barth spent a couple of moments, closed his Bible, he took hold of the pulpit, and his eyes swept the crowd. Karl Barth said this: "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so," and sat down. Our final hymn this morning is "I've Decided to Follow Jesus."